For more on the ongoing regional crisis, we can bring in Hussein Ibish, senior resident scholar at the Arab Gulf States Institute. Hussein, thank you so much for joining us today on the program. Now, as we've been reporting, it appears that Israel is determined to create a buffer zone in southern Lebanon.
Yeah.
Is this something the Lebanese government will be willing to agree to?
No, I don't. No, they certainly won't formally agree in writing or even verbally that Israel has the right to create a depopulated area in the south of the country that it controls. Now, the Lebanese government doesn't have to agree to that. The Israelis are likely to go ahead and do it. The question is how big a chunk of Lebanon are they going to use? That's the first question. And if it's very small, if it's very thin layer, then that's something that could be sustained for a short period of time without backfiring. But the problem is that if Israel either seizes a larger chunk of Lebanon, which they've been talking about potentially everything up to the Litani River, which depending on what part of the river you measure from is more than a tenth and sometimes up to close to, a fifth of the country, and declares that effectively an uninhabited or uninhabitable area and establishes a long-term occupation, what will happen is Hezbollah will use that as a rationalization to continue being armed, continue operating against Israel and also against the Lebanese state and rebuild itself.
Now, Hussein, these talks that are being held between Israel and Lebanon, Hezbollah is not a part of them. So with that being said,
Right.
how significant are the talks?
No, the talks are remarkably significant because they are really the first serious negotiation between Israeli and Lebanese officials in history. It's not they haven't met before. They have one, in the 90s and then once before that. But, those were very perfunctory things. This is the beginning of a dialogue that if the Lebanese are serious, and if the Israelis can contain themselves and behave responsibly, which they really have never done in Lebanon, could eventually actually lead to a Lebanese-Israeli agreement that even involves Lebanese recognition of Israel and the creation of a genuinely calm northern border for Israel and southern border for Lebanon. That is possible. But it requires the Lebanese to be firm with Hezbollah over time. It's not something that can happen overnight, but the military as well as the government has to act against Hezbollah over time and be strong. But more atypically, the Israelis have to not overplay their hand. They have to not seize Lebanese territory, depopulate the south, and especially not try to drag Lebanon into their sphere of influence and sort of bully Lebanon and try to establish a Pax Israelica. The Pax Syriana that existed in the 90s was the longest lasting such effort, and even that fell apart. Lebanese history shows that any group, internal or external, that tries to exercise its will over the whole country ends up being defeated by everybody else. And that's happened to the Israelis many times, and I don't know why they can't learn from their own history.
Now, Hussein, as you mentioned, there have been previous ceasefire agreements. I'm thinking back to 2024 with the goal of disarming Hezbollah, which hasn't happened. So at this point,
Right.
are there signs that the Lebanese people are getting fed up with Hezbollah?
Oh, no, without a doubt. The Lebanese people are fed up. I've never seen anything like it. I was in Beirut when this war began for the first few weeks, and the backlash was almost total. So that you ended up with the country divided into two sections, those who are really with Hezbollah and everybody else. And the everybody else used to be lots of different ways of looking at Hezbollah. After Hezbollah launched their perfunctory attacks on Israel following the death of Ayatollah Khamenei in Iran, who was killed by the Israelis, early on in the conflict with Iran, the Lebanese people in general were horrified that they were going to be dragged into yet another pointless war with Israel, just on behalf of Iran, and for Hezbollah to pose as revolutionaries and as loyal members of the Iranian alliance and all that. I've never seen the Lebanese people in general so upset with Hezbollah. And did the Lebanese government use that backlash to declare Hezbollah's arms illegal and declare their paramilitary activity extra-constitutional and banned? And they've never done that before. Since the formation of Hezbollah in 1982, it's always been true that this was illegal to have your own military and, do your own wars. But they came out and said it. And the only thing is, the military is still hesitant to act. The commander of the army, Rudolf Heikel, is obviously afraid the army will split if it acts, really aggressively against Hezbollah, and also afraid that he's going to be left holding the bag and the military will be blamed if there's a civil conflict or some other breakdown in the policy. So one of the challenges now is for the government to be able to convince the military to act more decisively. And that's essential. But that can't happen as long as Israel is on a rampage. So, in other words, the two sides have to act atypically. The Lebanese government has to go after Hezbollah in a much stronger way than they want to. And Israel has to be much more restrained than it wants to. And if they both do that, they can get what they both want, which is a Lebanon freed from Hezbollah domination and manipulation. But the problem is they're at cross purposes, and so it's very difficult.
Hussein, speaking of trying to get what you want, I want to shift a bit and talk about Tehran and Washington. There's been a lot of posturing and tough talk from both sides over the Strait of Hormuz. So are we likely to see it reopen before that ceasefire agreement ends on Wednesday?
It doesn't look like it, right? I mean, the Iranians are clearly split. And that's a really interesting reflection of how difficult the situation is for them. I think a lot of people outside of Iran have been focused, and especially in the West and in the U.S., have been focused on the problems the U.S. has been facing in this war and the limitations of Donald Trump's strategy and the wisdom of the attack and all that stuff. And it's all true. This was a very badly thought through and badly carried out war on the American side. But what has gone missing is the incredible difficulty that Iran has been under. And I've been saying for a long time, yes, but you wouldn't want to trade places with Tehran. And I think the difficulty that Iran is in is attested to by the fact that you have these two factions openly quarreling, publicly quarreling with people who want to make a deal with Washington, saying, oh, the Strait's open, we're going to cooperate, etc. And more hardline factions in the IRGC and what have you say, absolutely not, firing on Indian ships, threatening other commercial shipping. And, if Iran were not in dire straits, the government wouldn't have split like this publicly. It's a really important indication of how badly things are going for Iran, that you have two factions that have emerged in public.
Now, we've also heard that the top negotiator, Iran's parliament speaker, has said that, they're making progress, but a deal is still pretty far away. So do we know what the sticking points are?
Not exactly, but we do know what the two major issues are. One is the Strait of Hormuz. Trump cannot go very far without Iran essentially recognizing the Strait of Hormuz as international waters that with freedom of navigation applies. If they keep trying to make extraterritorial claims on the waters of the Gulf and claim that this is somehow their territory and they get to control it, or they get to charge a toll and extort money and engage in what amounts to piracy, Trump is open to the accusation inside the U.S. and globally, that he made matters worse, right? That, in other words, before the war, this was not the case. And now, because of him, Iran has learned that it can control this area just by threatening shipping without even doing much or doing very little action. They can really shut down international commerce there and trap their neighbors, the Gulf countries, and deny oil to the world. Now, as long as that's the case, Trump is very vulnerable to criticism, and it's justifiable criticism, of course, which is why he's vulnerable to it. And he's got to deal with that. So that's one issue. The other is the deeper issue of the nuclear file, which, again, there's the question of what Iran does with the 900 pounds, about 450 kgs of highly enriched uranium that they still possess somewhere somehow, and also their future of their enrichment program. So they're going to have to agree ultimately to hand over to somebody, Pakistan. It might have been Russia, but the Ukraine war has changed that. So I think it's going to be Pakistan with U.S. oversight, or the U.S. itself, or something. They're going to have to give that stuff up and agree to not enrich beyond the very low levels required for electricity production, and with oversight. If they do that, they probably get a deal. But I don't think Trump can go much further unless Iran makes an agreement to reopen the Strait of Hormuz. So the most upbeat scenario would be some sort of an agreement before the end of next week, that the strait will be opened, at least temporarily, in order to make way for further talks where they try to see if they can make a deal based on time. So that something like the Obama deal, where Obama got Iran to agree not to go any further for 10 to 12 years and give their enriched uranium to Russia. So in this case, it would be probably Trump would demand more than 12 years, maybe 20 or something. And the material would go to Pakistan with American oversight, or to the U.S., or something like that. Maybe even there's a third party, not Russia and not these other countries. So we would, that's possible. But I don't think it's likely to happen. I think what's more likely is that ultimately this war turns into a prolonged stalemate, which the Israelis call mowing the grass, where you have U.S. and/or Israel repeatedly bombing Iran from time to time, and then Iran responding, and the whole thing turning into a protracted standoff, like the U.S. had with Iraq in the 90s, and the Israelis have with Hezbollah and Hamas in Lebanon and Gaza.
Now, Hussein, I want to follow up on your point there about this enriched uranium. There are reports that the U.S. is considering a $20 billion cash deal for the uranium. How credible do you think that is? And if it turns out to be credible, isn't it worse than the one the Obama administration made with Tehran, the one you mentioned?
No, I think it's very similar, because what you're talking about here is not a cash payment from the United States to Iran. I think that's how critics, frame it. But that's not what's being apparently discussed. What they're talking about is unfreezing $20 billion of Iranian assets that are frozen elsewhere. In other words, allowing them to access their own money that has been withheld from them because of sanctions. And I think no, it's not worse. It's actually very similar to what happened in the Obama era, where similarly frozen Iranian assets were unfrozen as an inducement for Iran to make a deal. At that time, Republicans and right-wingers and all that started screaming about pallets of cash, pallets of cash. They sounded like parrots, pallets of cash. It was absurd. But it doesn't mean it doesn't make sense. That was a political stance. And again, I think people could criticize Trump for that if he did it, but it makes perfect sense. Like, what kind of inducement are you going to give Iran to hand over this material? Just stopping bombing is probably not enough. I think offering them access to their own money that eventually they're going to end up getting somewhere or another is a very reasonable thing to do. And I don't think it's worse at all than what Obama did. I think it's very similar. And if Trump makes a deal, it's going to be very similar to the deal that Obama got, because that's all that's available to the U.S. and Iran. And Trump was wrong that that was the worst deal ever, and he was wrong to pull out of it. And the whole thing has been a fiasco. But getting back to that same kind of an arrangement is a good idea. It just shouldn't have taken all this time and death and money and bombing and all that to get back to where we were when Trump first came into the White House. But, there you go.
Now, Hussein, there was a meeting here in Paris on Friday with the UK and other Western allies to discuss how to ensure the security of the Strait of Hormuz. That, of course, was when we got news that it had been opened and now it's closed again, and Iran fired on tankers. So what does the latest news do to those plans?
Yeah, and that's very interesting, because what you have here is several different actors moving at the same time. You have the U.S. and Iran with their competing blockades, and then you have the international community, the European states, the Asian powers, who are basically the customers for a lot of this energy that should be coming out of the Strait of Hormuz, Qatari LNG and petroleum from countries like Iraq and Kuwait and Qatar and Bahrain, and to some extent Saudi Arabia, though they have a pipeline that goes in the opposite direction. But certainly Qatar, Bahrain, and Kuwait and the others are cut off. And so what you end up with then is an international interest in reopening the strait and maintaining the freedom of navigation there. Iranian attempt to make the Strait of Hormuz de facto Iranian territorial waters is an affront to international interests, global interests, and to commerce. So the problem is that European states that opposed this war, and they were right to do it, but still, they who've been bullied by Trump, are loath to come in and kind of back him up on this. But I think ultimately the international community, including the Asian countries and the European countries, the customers of the Gulf countries, have a real interest and an obligation ultimately to help ensure freedom of navigation here. So it is necessary that once the strait is reopened, there is an international consortium that can dispatch ships to the waters of the Gulf, at least for a period of a decade or two, to ensure that Iran doesn't try this again, and to protect shipping and to maintain order in the Strait of Hormuz. This should not be an American mission for multiple reasons. It should be a global mission. And European states are ideally suited to lead this. It would not be war with Iran. It would be essentially peacekeeping on the high seas. And I think European states and East and South Asian states are in a position to do that, and they need to do it. It would be a very responsible thing for them to do, and it shouldn't be framed as entering the conflict on behalf of the United States. And in fact, it won't happen until the conflict is over. But once the conflict is over, I do think the international community, including Europe and Asia, need to act to ensure that Iran doesn't try to pull this stuff again.
Yes. Hussein, thank you so much for joining us on the program today. It's always great to talk to you. That's Hussein Ibish,
Anytime.
Senior Resident Scholar at the Arab Gulf States Institute.